Today we have seen our first hints of the fourth region of the Drakenbriar. We came upon a large swathe of open ground with new growth barely clinging to life. The twisting briars there seem to rise almost painfully out of fallen ash or creep sinuously over dark basalt. Yet we are by no means clear of the twisting forest just yet. The landscape is becoming a curious patchwork of primeval woodlands and barren open ground. As we proceed deeper into the biome, it seems as though the patches of forest are becoming smaller and more sparse as the open ground grows ever more prevalent. This might be for the best, as these woods are not lacking in worrisome occupants. The gravity is quite low this far into the biome, and some of the resident arthropods have become troubling in their size. Earlier this morning, I happened to see something that looked like a cross between a cricket and an assassin bug. It had the air of a patient predator, and I could just make out the piercing beak tucked away beneath its body. More disturbing still was the thing we encountered a little later on in one of the more undisturbed patches of forest. It looked vaguely like an orbatid mite, but while those creatures are microscopic, this arachnid had grown nearly as tall as a person. We kept our distance, and thankfully it did not seem at all interested in us. For the moment, we've camped in a relatively small patch of relatively young forest. Trees enough for concealment, but not so tall as to leave us in the gloom. We do still have the occasional arthropod for company, but only creatures of relatively modest size thus far. Toby, Jack, and Scrimshaw have gone to reconnoiter and hopefully find a proper path to the furthest outpost of the Drakenbriar. This has left Charlotte and myself to see what we can do with our current provisions. She took the opportunity to ask me why I was actually here. I feigned innocence for a moment or two, but couldn't resist a faint smile. Not surprisingly, she was undeceived by my poor attempt at humor. After a quick look over our surroundings to confirm the others hadn't yet returned, I told her the tale that has inspired me to come to this hellish place. This is a story with several retellings. It was likely old even when the Oddvar tales were first written. Though there are a number of variations, a few themes remain more or less constant. A warrior of some sort or another enters the Hell of Thorns. He is seeking an unusual treasure, a fruit with superlative healing properties. He was driven on this quest by the peril of somebody close to him. Depending on the precise version, it might be his bride, or his child, or his brother, but it is always somebody important. He enters the thorns at twilight beneath a cloud of ash, searching deep within the nightmarish realm. When at last he finds the fruit he has sought, it is growing from a particularly large and vicious example of the Butcher Briar. Moreover, it is being guarded by some manner of horrible creature. Some accounts describe it as an abnormally large Lindwyrm, while others depict a particularly vicious wyvern. The version that is likely to be the oldest simply describes it as a primordial monster worse than all other creatures. Naturally, our would-be hero fights this creature. He wounds it and is wounded in turn. The bite is venomous, and he begins to feel the poison's effects even as the monster is driven away, at least for a time. As he wonders if he will live long enough to bring the fruit back to his compatriot, he notices something unusual happening to the surrounding vegetation. The monster's blood was spilled, and some was scattered onto the twisting, thorny stems. Wherever a drop of blood has landed, strange red foliage begins to bloom. The hero, presumably acting upon instinct, uses some of this crimson growth on his wound and finds it is an antidote to the poison. He proceeds to pluck the fruit and hurries back to his stronghold. His beloved is revived and all seems to be well. In a couple of versions, the story continues with a curious addendum. The hero tries to bring the fruit back to other settlements to share its healing properties with other people. However, it has rotted away to dust by the time he arrives, much to his dismay. Now here is the particularly curious thing about this story. The fruit is an obvious impossibility. The Butcher Briar is a lycophyte, like most plants within the Drakenbriar. Thus far, not a single variety of proper flowering plant has been found growing within the Hell of Thorns. Lycophytes do not produce fruits. They don't even produce seeds. reproducing instead by spores. This incongruity would have been patently obvious to the people living within the Drakenbriar, which leaves us with quite the mystery. What exactly could this fruit have possibly been? A more unsettling mystery would be just what manner of monster might be lurking among the thorns guarding this strange secret. When the others returned, we continued onward through the patch of forest. Oddly enough, it didn't give way to open country. Instead, the trees simply grew increasingly contorted. A small creature watched us for a time, scuttling and leaping from among the twisting branches as it observed. I believe it was a hatchling of some variety of drake, though beyond this idea I could only make vague guesses. The arboreal habit probably keeps it reasonably safe from larger predators on the ground. Jack asked me why the forest was becoming more of a bramble, so I shared the basic theory I've read. As the landscape becomes increasingly volcanically active, it becomes more difficult for proper trees to take root. There simply isn't enough time between disruptions to foster the growth of the more conventional sorts of large plant. However, due to the regular ash falls, the soil is rather fertile, so anything that does grow can grow remarkably fast. In addition, with gravity being much reduced, both plants and animals are able to grow to considerable size without worrying about conventional weight issues. The plants don't need quite as much internal support. Their cell walls don't need to be quite so thick, so they can spring up practically overnight. Thus, the plants that thrive here are the creeping opportunists, the briars and brambles that are able to grow very rapidly and spread out over wide areas. The thorns appear to be a mechanical defense to dissuade undue amounts of browsing. After all, the tissues themselves are relatively soft as they grow rapidly and lack any serious reinforcement. The thorns, then, are something of a countermeasure to this palatability. Most likely they are also rather toxic, but everything is poisonous here, and I'm sure the local fauna have adapted to metabolize most of these poisons. It was at this point that Jack asked me about the most infamous of the plants here, commonly known as the Butcher Briar. It is found only in the deepest regions, where we are ultimately headed to. I shared all I know of the plant and its disturbing natural history. The Butcher Briar is a singularly aggressive variety of lycophyte. The form is generally a leafless bramble with dark contorted stems. The only consistent features are the thorns, which are actually modified microphyls. As a lycophyte, the Butcher Briar has neither flower nor fruit. There are isolated reports of uneven red foliage on some of the branches, but these are most likely epiphytic growths. This singular plant has taken tenacity to an extreme, as is necessary in its native environment. At the edge of the explored Drakenbriar, the climate becomes remarkably hostile. There are numerous patches of scorched earth, and the sky is increasingly veiled by heavy clouds of ash. The air reeks of sulfur, and the ground trembles underfoot. In answer to the increasingly hellish environment, one finds the Butcher Briar. Instead of the more conventional tree lycophytes of the twisted forests, this species forms dense thickets of contorted brambles. The plant's thorns are particularly impressive, being both sharp and sturdy. These thorns also tend to be quite large, with a few rare examples exceeding 3 feet in length. More conventional dimensions range between 2 and 7 inches. This aggressive form of vegetation forms the basis of the local ecology. No surprise the region is most often referred to as the Hell of Thorns. Despite its hazards, this hellish place serves as the winter home for many of the largest and most dangerous draconid species. They have an unusual adaptation to cope with the omnipresent thorns. At the start of every summer, most draconids shed their skin. They migrate into the twisting forest to hunt and forage. In some cases, as with the wyverns, they venture as far as the high plateau. Their summer scales are relatively thin and lightweight, granting an appreciable degree of agility and freedom of motion. If they were to venture back into their winter home in this state, they would likely end up badly wounded. As summer progresses, this new skin steadily thickens and toughens. By the time autumn descends, it has hardened into nothing less than heavy armor. This armor is sufficient to protect against the thorns, allowing the creatures to hibernate safely in the relative warmth of this extreme environment. We have had a couple of memorable encounters today. The first was with a particularly large arachnid species. I've heard it referred to as the grave warden spider, though there are very few accounts of it. The creature was nearly as tall as we were and seemed quite aggressive. Thankfully, Charlotte made short work of the thing with her vorpal blade. Only Toby and myself have seen her wield that weapon before. Both Jack and Scrimshaw seemed quite taken aback. I wonder if Jack might have fallen in love, actually, but that is another matter. Scrimshaw was quick to approach the corpse, hastily cutting the fangs off to keep them. As he did so, he explained to me that he was something of a collector, and that was what had brought him to this biome in the first place. As he worked away at the tough exoskeleton, I began working on a somewhat different dissection. The venom of such a beast would fetch a good price with a number of researchers back home, and I wouldn't mind saving a sample or two for myself. So I sought out the poison glands and accompanying ducts and sacs, and was able to collect most of that precious material. I couldn't help but notice the ichor had a deep reddish pigmentation about it, suggesting something akin to hemoglobin. This piqued my curiosity, and so I moved on to the creature's underside. In many spiders there is a ventral orifice that leads into a set of simple book lungs. I soon found the equivalent in this creature. The lungs in this case were far from simple. They seemed every bit as elaborate as those found in a vertebrate. In short, it would seem that at least some of the larger arthropod species here have developed a quite advanced respiratory system. Toby was over my shoulder all the while, feverishly taking notes. He pointed out a similarly intricate closed circulatory system, all but unheard of in more normal arthropods. Our collective delving into arachnid physiology was cut short by a quiet warning from Jack. I felt Charlotte's hand on my shoulder as she pulled me roughly away from my work. Before I could object, she pointed towards the nearby trees. Something was approaching, and it was a good deal larger than the spider. We suddenly found ourselves face to face with a particularly large Lindwyrm. The thing must have stood at least as high as a 2-story building. I hate to think how long the actual body was. It regarded us briefly as we backed away from the spider's corpse. Then, without the least hesitation, it lowered its head and began devouring the spider. I watched for a moment or two as the sturdy front legs tore effortlessly through the armored hide of the creature. The jaws ripped away chunks of steaming viscera with sickening, wet, tearing sounds. Charlotte was kind enough to take my hand and pull me away. All 5 of us retreated as quietly as we could, taking advantage of this distracting meal to make our escape. So far as I'm aware, we haven't been followed, but we are all on edge. Several hours have passed now, and we have encountered another Lindwyrm. This one was thankfully a good deal smaller, but still dangerous. Both Charlotte and Scrimshaw were quick to act, drawing weapons and standing ready. Jack was right behind them a moment later. Mercifully, the creature saw that numbers were not in its favor, and it slithered off with alarming speed through the undergrowth. Nothing that large should be able to move that fast. When it was gone, we resumed our walk, moving a little faster ourselves. The daylight wouldn't last forever, and all of us were increasingly interested in finding our way to the final outpost. As we walked, Jack took me aside, noting how perturbed I seemed whenever I saw a Lindwyrm. Even the giant spider hadn't troubled me so deeply. Naturally, he was wondering just why the Lindwyrms in particular should be so terrifying. It was with some reluctance that I explained. There are only a few accounts to go by, but they are all very consistent with one another. The Lindwyrms are the primary inhabitants of the Hell of Thorns, able to slip through the tangled vegetation with relative ease. They make their lairs in warmer spots, near hot springs and the like, and actually prune and bend the Butcher Briars to their liking. Worse still, these briars seem overly well nourished compared to others nearby. Within the Lindwyrm lairs, the thorns grow to alarming sizes, developing jagged serrations. They are put to good use by the lair's owners. As winter approaches, a Lindwyrm will not necessarily eat all of what it kills. Not immediately, at least. Some carcasses are brought back to its lair and impaled on these overgrown thorns. There are worrisome rumors, in fact, that not every such creature is actually dead before it is impaled. I did not tell Jack the details of what some explorers have described when talking of the fates of their former companions. I didn't need to say anything, really. I believe he understood, judging by his sudden pallor and loss for words. It was then that he confided in me the actual reason for Scrimshaw's venture into this place. He was seeking one of these legendary oversized thorns to add to his collection. Apparently, he was fairly well known as a collector of liminal specimens back in the more normal reality. I was asked what our chances might be of getting out of this alive. I did not have a satisfactory answer to that question. After a long day of travel, we found our way at last to the Furthest Keep, the deepest outpost of the Drakenbriar. If it has any name at all, it is simply called Tumbledown. We first saw it as we emerged from a dense thicket of contorted vegetation. There was something spectral about the sight, the distant structure painted in the mournful hues of descending night. It seemed unearthly, with an architecture that should not normally be able to exist. Then again, the low gravity in this place allows considerable flexibility in such matters. We hurried towards this last stronghold as evening faded into night, stepping inside with considerable relief. The place was by no means crowded, but there were still a handful of people about, all hardened gem hunters by the look of them. I must admit I'm glad Scrimshaw was a part of our little band. He has a way with people, or at least the people in this realm. We've been warned tonight on a few occasions, warned to hurry with whatever our business is here, as the keep will be closed and locked for the winter in 5 days. Warned also about the wildlife. As winter approaches, some of the draconids will already be returning from the forest to this hellish region, their volcanic stronghold for waiting out the deepening cold and the encroaching darkness. Such warnings have left us all a bit uneasy, though we've not yet lost our resolve. If anything, Scrimshaw seems all the more desperate to collect his desired trophy before time runs out. I will admit my own goals and desperation are not so different in the end. Within the next few days, we will either find success or be forced to withdraw for the season. That is, if we manage to return at all.